Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this briefing. We're very pleased to have three ambassadors here to talk to you about the efforts to replenish the Peacebuilding Fund. And they've all been great supporters of the fund, and they will all be making some opening remarks before they will take your questions. They are Ambassador Olaf Skog of Sweden, Ambassador Macharia Kamau of Kenya, and Ambassador Juan Jose Camacho of Mexico. We will start first with Ambassador Skog of Sweden, then Ambassador Camacho of Mexico, and then Ambassador Kamau. Ambassador Skog, the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. The reason we called you here today was really to pitch a very important event that's happening next week. I realize that it's in competition with many things going on, but it's one with high relevance, but we felt that it might need a special pitch because of its political significance. It's the Peacebuilding Fund Pledging Conference. Now that sounds like numbers and money, but it's actually has an underlying political importance that we just wanted to stress to you. You will be aware, those of you who follow the UN closely, that last year there was a request made to Ambassador Rosenthal of Guatemala to put forward a review on the whole way in which the UN system prevents and builds peace, prevents conflicts and builds peace. Now, he and his colleagues identified several shortcomings, both in the way the UN intergovernmental system works, but also how the UN system by itself does not deliver in the way that the Charter had perhaps envisaged in terms of prevention. Now, as a result of that, two very significant resolutions were adopted, one by the General Assembly and a similar resolution by the Security Council last year on the whole peace-building architecture. But the main theme that came out of that was really the notion of how we need to do much better in terms of sustaining peace. It's about prevention in the traditional way of looking at it, preventing conflict from erupting in the first place, but it's also to make sure that as we are active in resolving conflicts with heavy peacekeeping operations, etc., we need to avoid falling back into conflict, which unfortunately has occurred very often. So those resolutions have actually, I mean, there's a lot of UN lingo in those, but we just wanted to tell you that that is, at least to my mind, and I think it's shared by our colleagues here, a very significant way forward. And it puts the pressure on the system to deliver better and to all of us as member states to deliver better. Now, we always speak about how, preventing conflict saves money in the end because, you don't have to spend as much when the conflict breaks out in peacekeeping, etc. And of course, that's very true. But let's not also forget that conflict is very much connected to development. And we know that conflict is a major obstacle to development. We also know that in the dire humanitarian needs of the world, much of that is triggered by conflict. So it all sort of is very compelling reasons for us to do much better in terms of preventing conflict in the first place and sustaining peace. Now, together with Kenya, Sri Lanka, Mexico, Somalia, the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and the UK, we, Sweden, are co-hosting this conference to pledge more money into the Peacebuilding Fund, a fund that exists under the auspices of the Secretary General with the aim of putting, investing sometimes in risky environments, but very much targeted to prevention and early action. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of this conference. My country will certainly pledge. We have been a staunch supporter financially and politically of this whole notion and also of this Peacebuilding Fund since the start. And there is more money coming. As I said, I want to end by that of course there's a risk that this conference is overshadowed by the main summits of next week on migration and refugees, etc. But let's not forget that there is a clear connection here. If we are able to stop these conflicts from emerging in the first place, much of what we see today as the refugee situation, putting a lot of pressure on individuals and countries, would of course not have happened in the first place. So I just wanted you to help us to pay attention to this very important work of prevention and peace building.
Ambassador Camacho.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to add 2 or 3 elements to what my distinguished colleague just said. This pledging conference is happening at the same time or within the biggest framework of 2, if I can say it this way, potentially paradigm changes or shifts in the organization and the member states. One, my colleague has described it, which is the notion of sustaining peace. Basically, it does mean that we need to invest in prevention rather than only in reaction. And then the biggest mandate that this organization should have is both ending conflict and maybe above all avoiding conflict. So we need to refocus on that in that sense. Second, paradigmatic shift, if I can put it this way, is precisely the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, that has put in the center, in the core of this organization, development. And this is extremely relevant, not only because development in itself is fundamental, but also because the only way we can avoid conflict or solve conflict at the very end is through development, is through reducing inequalities, is through creating stronger institutions, is through bringing the state back, is through ensuring access to rights, health, education, etc., etc. So these 2 very important new instruments that we have, sustaining peace, development goals, are the core, the framework, the new box where this pledge is taking place. If you see figures, 2 or 3 figures that are extremely important and describe well the situation. If you see the total budget of the UN organization, everything, regular and peacekeeping, you will see that 70%, around 70% of out of 12, something like that, billion a year, is spent in peacekeeping, 70%. And only 30%, more or less roughly, is spent in development. There is something wrong there. So these new paradigmatic shifts try to address that. Not because numbers matter, but because we need to bring these more fundamental objectives to avoid peace, avoid conflict. So it's development, etc., etc. Another figure. We are, our target for this conference is 300 million. The annual spending, both of the organization in peacekeeping, plus globally from whatever source of humanitarian aid, is in the region of 30 billion US dollars a year. What we are aspiring to, our target is 300. And we believe not only that 300 is a reasonable target, but it's a target that can bring in additional tools for this organization, plus all the other requirements that my colleague just said, to start really making a difference. Thank you so much.
Okay, and Ambassador Kamal?
Thank you. Let me just complement what has been said very well by my colleagues. And I'll start with something that Ambassador Skoog said, or at least related to that. Not since the Second World War and the crisis in the subcontinent of India have we had such a shrill disruption to peace in the world. We're literally seeing this huge movement of peoples driven either by conflict or war or civil strife or climate and climate effects. And this is now becoming a huge disruptor of the peace that we've enjoyed in the world in the last 50 odd years, at least in many, many countries. So instead of seeing a situation where the United Nations at 70 is witnessing a world which is increasingly enjoying peace and prosperity, what we're seeing is the United Nations at 70 witnessing a world that seems to be under huge stress and where the social, economic, and political developments are beginning to drive and undermine peace. This work that is being done right now by the Peacebuilding Commission and the Group of Friends for Sustaining Peace, of which, Ambassador Camacho is the chair, could not have come at a more important time. It's critically important that we get this right. It is sad, it is almost tragic to imagine that we are having a pledging conference for peace. It's almost absurd. We as the United Nations should be the manifestation, we as member states of this great institution should be the manifestation of what peace truly is in the world. As you just heard from Ambassador Camacho, a $30 billion organization, money raised from member states, from taxes, from individuals from around the world, cannot find 300 million to invest in peace. How tragic is that? This is why we're saying that something fundamentally different has to happen. The rhetoric that we seem to have on peace and peace building is way, way ahead of our willingness to face up to the challenges of delivering on peace. And I think, as I said, if we look at the trends in the Middle East, in parts of Africa, in some parts of Asia, if we look at the trends, they are worrisome. And somehow we have to come to the realization that if we don't get our act together, this very agenda that we only adopted a few months ago, that is supposed to guarantee peace and prosperity for all, will be nothing but an ephemeral wish. So when we say we want peace, when we want to sustain peace, what we're really championing is that the primacy of politics, which is a core issue of the resolutions that were spoken to by Ambassador Skoog, the primacy of politics must be retained throughout all political challenges that we are facing in the world. It cannot be that we resort to arms. The resorting to arms and wars and civil strife cannot solve the problems that we face. Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, the list is long. South Sudan. Once you leave the negotiation table and primacy and politics is no longer the way of resolving the issues, we end up with nothing but disaster. And we believe that this cannot be the way of the future. And it definitely cannot be the way of implementing the 2030 agenda. So that's what we're pushing for. This conference is only almost a symbolic. It's almost a symbolic action. It's a signal we are trying to send to the world that something absolutely serious needs to be done, and it needs to be done by us, the people of the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much.